Hi, my name is John Consalvi, and I'm the CEO of LinguaHealth and Grupo Lingua. Today we're talking to Dr. Brenda Gorman about her research in speech-language pathology and literacy issues. Dr. Gorman, thanks for coming.
I'm glad to be here.
Dr. Gorman, can you summarize some of the findings in your recent article in Language, Speech, Hearing Services in the Schools?
I certainly can. Let me give you some background information. First, I want to say this was a really fun study I conducted with some colleagues. Christine Fiestas, who's at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, Elizabeth Pena, who's at the University of Texas at Austin, and Maya Reynolds-Clark at Armstrong Atlantic. And to give you just a little bit of background information, one thing we do that's very important for speech-language pathologists to do as part of our assessment practices is analyze children's language in time, their spontaneous language. And we know that standardized assessments can be limited in certain ways. For example, standardized tests very often have children respond by pointing or giving short responses. In contrast, collecting a language sample really shows us what children can do productively. And so they give us just a lot of rich information about their grammar, about their vocabulary, about their literate language skills, their background knowledge, and it's a highly recommended part of our assessment practice. What we often do is use wordless picture books to help children generate a narrative. So they'll be looking at a book with no words on the page. They'll essentially use the pictures to help narrate a story. And we tend to think that it is less biased than a lot of the standardized assessments that we traditionally use. However, because there is more spontaneity, less rigid guidelines for how we analyze the information, while we use these to be less biased in certain ways, clinical judgment can actually bias our interpretation. So clinicians, we all have certain expectations for what we expect children to produce in a narrative, and some of our expectations are culturally influenced. Children's narratives are culturally influenced. So we were interested in looking at how culture may sort of shine through in children's stories, given that, again, it's a somewhat structured task. Children are looking at the same book, the same pictures, the same length, yet we wanted to look at how culture was still influencing their narrative production. We analyzed all sorts of features, some of which have been shown already to sort of shine through in children's stories, and others that we observed and wanted to see if they did seem to show up in patterns by ethnic group. So we looked at the stories of African American children, Latino children, and Caucasian children. And we wanted to look at three main areas. Content. So again, they're all looking at the same pictures, but were there unique components related to content that the children were giving us? Structure. Structure has been looked at a lot previously, but we wanted to see in this context, wordless picture book narratives, if there were differences in structure between children's narratives, between the three groups, as well as function. So stories serve various functions. They serve to communicate information, to express emotions, express personal events. Adults use stories to transmit morals, cultural knowledge, to entertain. So we wanted to look at that element as well to see if, again, there were some creative and stylistic features coming out in children's narratives. And indeed, we did find many similarities across the three groups, which is good news because, again, we've used narratives as a means of less biased assessment. On the one hand, we were happy that there was some consistency. The structure was very similar. All children produced what we call topic-centered narratives, meaning in mainstream culture, we typically expect a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? In a fairly linear structure. And children did predominantly produce that topic-centered narratives. However, it was interesting, the children were all first and second graders, and really only 50 to 65% of children produce those topic-centered narratives. So from a developmental perspective, that's very informative because a clinician can often go in and expect, well, this is what I'm going to get. These children are in first and second grade. Yet while we saw no differences across ethnic groups, we did see that, wow, approximately half of the children were actually giving us these stories. So again, developmentally, it's important for us to know what to expect. These were all typically developing children. So while structure we didn't see differences, we did see differences in terms of content and function. And for example, we found that the African American children seemed to use more direct dialogue. Direct dialogue meaning actually producing the language that the character would say, as opposed to indirect dialogue where we say, he said such and such, she said such and such. So the African American kids did use more direct dialogue, which is very engaging with the audience, right? The African American children also tended to use more fantasy and suspense in their story, so high level of engagement with the audience, right? Whereas the Latino children tended to name their characters more often. And we weren't particularly surprised, but we didn't know exactly what we were going to find because family has been shown in other research to be a very important component in Latino culture. So we didn't know if it was going to be significant. It was, but the Latino children did tend to name their characters on their own. They didn't hear names produced by us. They just, oh, I'm going to call this character so-and-so. And the Caucasian children, this was a little surprising for us too. They tended to discuss the nature of character relationships significantly more than the other groups. So the characters in this story, they would be very specific. This is so-and-so's baby. This is the mama. This is the friend, that sort of thing. We were actually expecting, based on previous literature, again showing the importance of family and Latino culture, that if there was going to be a significance there, we thought it would probably show up with the Latino children, and it didn't. It showed up with Caucasian children. But so in essence, again, the important findings are, it did seem to reiterate that looking at structure, that narrative assessment was not a biased assessment task, which is good news. However, our findings really showed us that we need to focus, in terms of assessment and intervention, that we need to look not only at structure, not only at beginning, middle, end, not only at story components, but really what is the content, what is the function of stories for children. Again, the African American children gave really good examples of how culture influenced their stories, using more dialogue, more fantasy and suspense. And if you think, it seemed to show the tradition of a strong, a heavy emphasis on the interaction between the narrator and the audience. Again, that being particularly emphasized. And again, this was a storybook in front of them, and that was still coming out in their narratives. So those are other things we can look at in terms of assessment. The more we can understand about how culture influences children's narratives, the better we will be at determining what is normal, distinguishing those differences from disorders. As well as ASHA recommends that culturally competent services include intervention that is culturally relevant to children. Again, that beginning, middle, end, only looking at vocabulary, only looking at grammar. We can also look at culturally relevant ways of helping children produce performance narratives. They're really used to entertain their audiences. As again, you can probably think of a story you've heard that, well, yes, it's very accurate. Yes, it's a very linear structure, but it's boring, as opposed to a really engaging, dynamic narrative. Put those two together, that would be a really good narrative. So in terms of intervention, we can really think of both components. So it was a really fun study, and I continue to look forward to what we'll continue to learn about culture and narration.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to seeing your next research article about narratives and use with this population.
My pleasure. You're welcome.